One of the questions that I get asked the most about on Path of Exile 2 is the process of crafting. And so today we're going to be going over the process of crafting, and I will be trying to answer a lot of the questions that I get asked frequently, which are what items do I look to craft on, what bases do I look for, etc., so forth, so forth. Now, as it currently stands, I would not recommend or suggest most people of the community to begin crafting or profit crafting. It can be a huge money sink. The price of omens is massively overpriced, and unfortunately, it's not really friendly for most players in the game to craft their own gear. Crafting, for the most part, as it currently stands, is essentially restricted to if you have an item that you're using, and let's say you have a modifier on the item that you don't necessarily need, you can come to Alva, you can buy an omen that will specifically affect a modifier on an item that you may not necessarily need, and you can try to upgrade your own gear, which is exactly what I did. All of these items that I am currently wearing are items that I bought for relatively cheap. I bought omens, and I made them better. But again, I probably went through hundreds, if not 1,000 or more divines to get some of my items to the point where they are currently at. So I don't recommend most people to, again, there are a lot of videos out there on this subject, but I would not recommend most people to begin crafting. A lot of streamers, for example, Farmer, the biggest issue I have with Farmer is that he essentially kind of made crafting difficult for most players because the price of omens are already ridiculous, and Farmer, towards the start of the league, had went through and bought all of the craftable bases. Now, again, no hate, no flame. It is a video game at the end of the day. Play it how you enjoy it. But, you know, the reality of the situation is Farmer did sort of buy up a lot of the market and make it difficult for other players to craft out gear that they might necessarily need for themselves, right? And what he did was he sold most of the items. And I think he sort of gave an unrealistic sort of taste for most people in terms of what you can expect, because I've crafted many of the same items that Farmer has crafted, and I have just lost thousands of divines because they don't necessarily sell. Another content creator that is very, avid on the topic of crafting is Belton. And to my knowledge, Belton receives most of the divines that he uses on loans. So I would also stay away from taking information regarding Belton. Now, they are very knowledgeable crafters, don't get me wrong. They're very knowledgeable players. They're very skilled at crafting itself. But at the end of the day, RNG is a gamble. And if you want to craft an item, which I will go over in this video, I would really recommend you to have well over 1,000 divines, unless you're just looking to make tiny changes to your build along the way, such as, like, let's say I didn't need this max life on these gloves. I could potentially roll the life off and get another damage roll. I could also brick it. I could roll a modifier that can't necessarily be rolled off, which we'll get into later. But yeah, if you have 1,000 plus divines and you want to craft an item that might be worth a mere, that is essentially what crafting is reserved down to. But even then, you could spend well over a mere crafting an item worth a mere. It's at the end of the day, it's all RNG. It all boils down to that. And as you can see, I am very, very broke. There are many items, as I said, that I've crafted throughout the course of this league that don't necessarily sell for what they price check for. Some people ask me how I price check items in game. Personally, I use PoE2 overlay. This will price check all relevant items at your current price value or current value of the items. So for example, this will price check all items that are better than this ring. If you want to change these values, you can come over here into the side and we can lower these to give us a more realistic idea of what our item's worth. But let's just say that we, for example, change out some of these values and search this ring, right? This ring comes up for a minimum of 80 divines with significantly worse values and without a tier 1 resistance on it. I've had this ring listed anywhere from 100 divines to 120 divines. It is not an amazing ring. Obviously, it's T1, T2. It has T4 rarity on the top. But it is a double rarity, T1 attribute, T1 resistance, 70 plus weighted sum damage ring, and it will not really sell. We have other examples of rings here that have been listed for quite some time, anywhere from 50 to 100 plus divines. At one point in time, this ring here, which is double T1 rarity, T1 cold, T1 accuracy, perfectly rolled T2 lightning, and fractured T2 dex, at one point in time I had this ring listed for 80 divines. Now, all of these rings are items that we invested well over 200 divines into a piece. These were some of the best outcomes that we got along the way. Unfortunately, we did brick a few items, such as this ring here, that unfortunately fractured the percent lightning damage. But again, at the end of the day, 90% of the time, you will lose money attempting to craft in this game. So, for most players, I would recommend to stay away from crafting, but if you have a bunch of spare currency laying around and you want to have a little bit of fun, or if you want to upgrade your own gear, I will get into the subject of crafting and sort of how to craft your own gear and, you know, potentially make money in the process if you brick an item and you want to sell it, or maybe you start crafting an item. For example, this ring here, these were meant to be triple damage rings or double T1 damage with rarity. Unfortunately, we ended up rolling accuracy on them, which has value for Amazon, so I just kept the accuracy. We have other rings here that we've crafted on. For example, this ring here is triple T1 suffixes with T1 fractured lightning damage, and so we've been working on this ring. But with that being said, we have invested over 300 divines into this ring alone, just hitting prefixes, and we have never rolled any T1 damage roll on this ring. So that is another, you know, concern to have. There are other rings as well. This is a ring I crafted for myself earlier in the league. This is a one that I got relatively lucky on. I did not invest that much into this ring for what I got out of it. I think this is a ring I got from a Breachstone. I used an Essence of Lightning on it. We got tier 1 lightning damage. I slammed it. I got tier 1 all res, or I got tier 1 all res through the greater Essence of Lightning. Then I slammed it. I got fizz damage and rarity, so I decided to keep crafting on it, and with only a few omens, this is the outcome we got. I tried to sell this ring for a while, and unfortunately, it would not sell, so I decided to corrupt it. Didn't really brick, but it also didn't really get any better because we just got life regen on it. So, yeah, I would, as I said, and again, also, with some of these rings, huge shout out to Bruck X in-game. He did donate some of these rings to us to craft on along the way. And as I said, we've put a lot of divines into these rings. But with that being said, and without further ado, let's get into the topic of crafting. Because crafting in Path of Exile 2 is actually relatively simple. It's essentially broken down to only a few omens, as well as a few other cool items. So you'll have some of these lesser omens here, omens of exaltations. These are relatively cheap. These are nice. But the big boys are the omens of whittling and the omen of sinistral and dextral erasure and, erasure and annulment. These are very valuable omens. They are currently, as it stands, in my opinion, extremely expensive. These should be a lot more frequent in the game. You should almost be guaranteed one of these from an audience with the king, which I'll get into later why that is. But essentially, you could go through anywhere from 100 to 500 omens per modifier on an item that you're looking to craft out, right? The Omen of Whittling, what it does is it will cause your next Chaos Orb to remove the lowest level modifier. Some people wonder what that really translates into. It doesn't mean the lowest value modifier on an item. For example, some people would think that damage taken recouped as life is a low value modifier. But if I were to use an Omen of Whittling on this amulet, it would actually hit the +3 melee skills before damage taken recouped as life. So that is something to keep in mind. Now, in order to check what level modifier an Omen is going to hit on an item, there are a few resources. The two best resources that there are for crafting in Path of Exile 2 are going to be, and I will pull up my display here, but they are going to be the Path of Exile 2 trade website, as well as Craft of Exile. Now, for anyone wondering how to get to the PoE2 section of Craft of Exile, it's at the top of the page here. It's also at the top on mobile. But if you go to craftofexile.com and then you click PoE2, this will bring you to a website that will give you deeper insight to items as a whole. So let's say that we were going to craft a breach ring. You can type in up here breach and go to breach ring. And this will tell you all of the modifiers that can roll on a breach ring and the item level that they will roll at. So, for example, it breaks it down into prefixes and suffixes as well. So, for example, right here we have suffixes. If we wanted to get tier 1 chaos resistance on a breach ring, it has a 0.146% chance to roll tier 1, and it has an item level of 81. Now, the item level requirement of a roll on an item essentially refers to how the omen will affect, the item as a whole. And so, as you can see here, if we were to roll, for example, tier 1 cold resistance on a ring, or fire resistance or lightning resistance, these have item levels of 82, which means that an omen will never hit these modifiers once you roll them onto an item. If I were to buy an Omen of Whittling, it doesn't matter what these rings here have on them. If they have a tier 1 resistance that's not chaos resistance, it will always take precedent over any other modifier on the item. Which means that if you don't perfectly roll an item in the proper order, you can potentially brick an item or have to start over entirely. So for example here, we can roll all attributes on a ring. But let's say all attributes was our second roll on a breach ring. All attributes has a high item level requirement of only 33, meaning that if you rolled tier 1 all attributes on a ring and then proceeded to roll leech, for example, leech percent of damage as mana, you would actually roll the all attributes off of the ring before you rolled the leech off with an Omen of Whittling. So this is something that is really important to keep in mind, is that you need to be using Craft of Exile to check the item level requirements of prefixes and suffixes in order to get an idea of what prefixes and suffixes you want to craft almost in order, right? Another example is this ring right here with the accuracy rating on it. Accuracy rating actually has a very low item level requirement, and so, for example, if I had an Omen of Whittling, the Omen of Whittling would hit, in this scenario, the accuracy before this tier 4 cold res, which, because one is a prefix and one is a suffix, what we can do to essentially fix that, if we wanted to hit this cold res, that's T2 rarity. So if we go to Craft of Exile and we look at rarity, right, rarity T2 has a chance to roll, let me just double check here. At tier 2, it has an item level requirement of 63. And 30% cold res has an item level requirement of 50. So we are able to remove the cold res before the rarity in terms of the suffixes, but we can't just remove the cold res before the accuracy. So in order to fix that, we use sinistral or dextral erasures as well as annulments. Now, what sinistral and dextral erasures do is they will cause your Chaos Orb to target prefix modifiers or suffix modifiers. So every item in Path of Exile 2 is broken down into prefix modifiers and suffix modifiers. Every item has 3 prefixes and 3 suffixes. Prefixes on gloves and rings are generally defenses, or such as life, mana, evasion, flat evasion percent, etc. for gloves. Or damage rolls. Suffixes tend to be resistances or damage modifiers, such as crit damage bonus, plus level to skills, such as on a wand, crit chance. On a wand, it really depends. Rarity can roll both as a prefix or a suffix. It's the only modifier in the game, I believe, that can. And so that is something to keep in mind as well. But, as I was saying, if we wanted to hit the cold res on this, we would need to buy a dextral erasure and combine it with an Omen of Whittling, and that would allow us to remove the cold res. Now, if I come back to Path of Exile, Craft of Exile here, and we take a look at Craft of Exile, and I turn my display capture back on, you will notice that most of these rolls on an item have a very low chance to roll, which is why I said that crafting can be sort of a pain in the butt, because let's say you wanted to make a ring and the most valuable modifiers on a ring are attributes, damage rolls, chaos res, all res. If you roll a tier 1 res, like I said, you can't really get it off the item. All res has a lot more value than a flat res, because if you roll a tier 1 like cold res or tier 1 fire res, for example, most likely someone at this point in the league is going to be buying a mirror or an expensive ring in order to mirror it with the Calandra's Touch, right? And so when it comes to something like all res, it has a lot more value on a ring than just flat tier 1 res, because you're probably going to be overcapped with the Calandra's Touch on a resistance if you have a tier 1 roll, as opposed to tier 1 all res or tier 1 chaos res. If you had, for example, tier 1 chaos res on a ring, you could mirror it and basically be chaos res capped without having to worry, especially with an ingenuity, without having to worry about anything else, right? But hopefully you guys can see why I said that crafting can be a massive money sink, is that because in order to hit any T1 modifier on an item, it is a very low chance and you're never guaranteed to hit the T1 modifier that you'd like. Now, my suggestion to GGG in order to fix this would be to introduce omens into the game that essentially guarantee higher tier rolls on an item. So like I said, these omens of Sinistral, Dextral, Erasure, Whittling, they should be almost a 100% drop rate from rituals and from audiences, because you could go through 100 or 200 of them before you hit any modifier that you actually want. You might brick an item in the process, and as it currently stands, you can't necessarily kill 100 audiences in an hour, meaning that you would still have to spend 10 hours on average just to hit one modifier on an item. And then I do think that they should have very expensive omens, right? Such as the price of these right now that guarantee higher tier rolls, not necessarily what roll you're going to get, chaos res, fire res, cold res, etc. But they should have something that essentially helps you out along the way. Now, another thing with crafting is that you really need to have an idea of all the builds in the game and what items sort of affect, certain builds and how to go about a build. For example, you could craft a staff, but chances are, unless you craft a perfect staff that's worth around a mirror, you're not going to get much value out of it because not many people are playing that build. If you build a perfect ring right now, even perfect ring right now might go for a mirror, but chances are it's only going to go for around 600 divines. Anything more than 600 divines can be a little bit risky because you'd have to do the trade in more than one trade anyways. So most people are probably going to stay away from trades that are worth a significant amount of money. Now, some of these items I have in my trade stash are very overpriced. Even that's probably overpriced. But just to show you guys again, in terms of what items might actually have value to craft on, I actually had this listed for 80 divines. And I pulled this up on Trade, which is the next resource that we'll get into in a minute, is how to use the Trade website. And if you take a look, for example, at this sleek jacket, this is a tier 2 sleek jacket. It's not amazing. It's not the best. It's got T1%, T2 spirit, T2 flat, ES energy shield, T2 fire res, T2 dex, T2 cold res. Any similar item in the game relative to this one price checks for hundreds of divines. And just to show you guys that, we'll come to the Trade website here. And on the Trade website, we have sleek jackets pulled up. Now, in order to search for this, I search for this item and get, a decent idea of what it's worth. Especially if you're a mobile player, you're going to be wanting to use PoE2 Trade, or not a mobile player, but a console player. Again, I've had a lot of people reach out to me and ask about console as a whole. And what I have to absolutely say about console is that I feel bad for you guys. GGG needs to release more compatibility for crafting on the console, applications, plugins, etc. for the console that allow crafting to be easier, price checking items to be easier. They need to update tooltips. I've had a lot of people complain about it, and I would agree with you guys. Everyone deserves a chance to be able to craft and to craft good items, right? But anyways, if we were to price check this sleek jacket, which again, I probably spent over 100 divines crafting. We got this as a drop together on stream. The prefixes were relatively good. The suffixes were kind of good, and so we spent a lot of money on omens to see if we could make it better. And I probably could have sold it for 10 or 20 divines as it dropped, but I decided to craft it out to see if I could make it worth more. And if we come to Trade, you guys will see that anything similar is a minimum of 100 divines. Now, like I said, I had that top listed for 80 divines for quite a while, actually. But in order to price check an item relatively, you are going to want to price check it worse than it currently stands or exists in your inventory, right? And so ours has 1161 evasion and 437 energy shield. So when we search this on Trade, we're going to come here to evasion and energy shield and put lower values in than we have on our own. Then we're going to come over here, and for example, the top has spirit on it. So we'll add a stat filter for spirit. We'll set it to 50. Ours says 56. And we'll also include that it has dex on it. Now, you can also use a weighted sum for attributes. You could search for intelligence and dex, which can both roll, and use a weighted sum, give each of them a value of 1, and then do a certain amount. Now, what I did was I just did dex, and I gave it no value so that it would show all sleek jackets with any amount of dex on them. But then the next part is to use weighted sums. Now, a lot of people have videos on this subject, weighted sums, etc. And the way that weighted sums work is you can add multiple modifiers to an item, assign them a value, and then give it an overall total weight. So right here, we added fire, lightning, cold res, gave each of them a weight of 1, and then set a weighted sum of 70. What this is going to do is show us all sleek jackets on the market that have at least 70% of these 3 combined resistances. You could also add, for example, chaos res in here and give it a value of 2. Reason being that chaos res is significantly rarer and has more value overall, right? Unless you're running a chaos inoculation build. And we will search. And again, this will show us all sleek jackets that have any relative value to this as it currently stands. And so as you can see, the cheapest one that would be worse than ours is around 100 divines. Now this one is actually better than ours. It has more spirit, more dex, more lightning res, more cold res. So this probably means that ours is overpriced. But again, I spent well over 100 divines on this sleek jacket alone, right? So again, just something to keep in mind. Crafting can be a massive money sink at times. Doesn't matter if you're crafting the best items in the game. I would almost strictly reserve crafting towards you know, crafting items for yourself or upgrading your own gear. I really wouldn't go out of my way in order to do much more than that. At the end of the day, unless you have thousands of divines, which most players don't really have. So don't go watch a video like Belton's and think that you can craft an item worth a mirror just immediately. It does take thousands of divines. I mean, if we look at craftofexile, it can be a 0.1% chance just to roll 1 modifier. So yeah, one of the questions I get asked a lot is, what items should I craft on? And the answer to that question is that if you don't have an item that looks similar to this ring, if you don't have at least 4 tier 1 modifiers that are all relevant, such as rarity, all res, an attribute or a res, and like a damage roll, I definitely would not craft on the item. I wouldn't bother about it. I wouldn't worry about it. I would just leave it as is. I would try to sell it as is. And if you can't sell it, I would recombine it with another item and I would take the loss. Because if you have more than like 2 modifiers that need to be worked on an item, you can really screw yourself. For example, this breach ring is item level 82. And if we come back to craftofexile and we search breach rings on craftofexile, this is something that can be a little bit rough with the prefixes, is that we can roll any % damage, right, which has an item level of 78, 76, etc. But let's actually take this off. We can also roll % increased chaos damage, which has an item level of 78, meaning that once we roll % increased chaos damage, we cannot roll it off over any other sub or prefix apart from % rarity. So let's say we rolled 2 T1 damage rolls, and that like T1 cold and T1 fire, or T1 cold, T1 lightning, or T1 fizz, T1 lightning, any variation of those. Let's say we rolled those modifiers and then we proceeded to slam the ring or use another whittling on it, and we hit T1% chaos damage. The item would essentially be bricked in the sense that you will no longer be able to remove this chaos damage without gambling and potentially losing the cold damage. Now, in order to gamble, you would just use a sinistral or dextral erasure without using any % damage or anything, or omen of whittling. Sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. But in order to gamble removing a modifier, it's a 50-50. You would have to use a dextral or sinistral without an omen of whittling and hit all of the prefixes or all of the suffixes and just gamble removing that modifier, right? So like I said, any and every item that you're trying to craft has the potential to brick. This would obviously mean that the best item level to craft a breach ring on would be item level 77. Even then, you could still brick it by rolling tier 1 mana, which, as you guys can see here, tier 1 mana, right, has a significantly higher chance to roll than any tier 1 damage. So again, at any point in time, you can brick a ring very easily. So some people ask, how do we avoid bricking items? How do we avoid this? If I'm crafting a bow, how do I avoid bricking a bow? If we look at bows and we come to Craft of Exile and we go to a Gemini bow, which again is a topic that we'll get into in a little, but there are two bows with the prefix or with the implicit bow attacks fire an additional arrow. There's a Gemini bow and there's a twin bow. As you guys can see here, twin bow base rolls 34 to 64 physical damage, whereas a Gemini bow base rolls 46 to 87. They have the same attack speed and the same crit chance, which means that Gemini bows are the better bow base to work with because they have the same implicit, but the Gemini bow has more damage on it. But if we take a look at a Gemini bow, for example, we have a bunch of modifiers on the bow that can roll. Now, when you're working on an item and you're crafting out, you most likely want to work on the prefixes or the suffixes. If you're crafting it from scratch, one at a time, finish them out, and then work on the other one. It'll make your life a lot easier. You'll end up spending a lot less money on omens, right? But if we look at the suffixes, Tier 1, for example, crit damage bonus, Tier 1 attack speed has an item level of 37. Tier 1 crit damage bonus has an item level of 73. Tier 1 crit chance also has an item level of 73. And so, what this means is that if we started crafting on a bow and we accidentally rolled gain life per enemy killed, this would brick the item at any point in time. We'd have to gamble. Let's say you had bow attacks fire 2 additional arrows, percent increased critical damage bonus, and you were just trying to hit crit chance, attack speed, or prod skills as your last modifier. At any point in time, you have a chance to brick the item. So how do we avoid that? How do we try to prevent that? Well, your best bet and your best option to avoid bricking an item are through using fracturing orbs. Fracturing orbs are very, very nice. They allow you to fracture a modifier on an item so that that modifier can never change. So if you're crafting an item from scratch, the general process is that you want to fracture a modifier that has the least item level requirement on the item so you never have to worry about losing that modifier. So when it comes to a bow, for example, you would want to fracture crit damage bonus or critical hit chance because bow attacks fire 2 additional arrows has an item level requirement of 82, which means that once you get that modifier on that item, you never have to worry about losing it. It is the highest item level modifier on an item, but it is also the rarest. So you could fracture bow attacks fire 2 additional arrows, chaos spam a bow for crit damage or crit chance, and then slam and hope to get slam with a dextral exaltation, which will add only suffix modifiers, and then gamble a null. But on average, this would cost hundreds, if not thousands of divines, and the reason being is that if we take a look at Craft of Exile, again, T2 crit chance or T1 both have a 0.1% chance to roll. Same thing with crit damage bonus, 0.2% chance. So you're basically gambling and relying on hitting bow attacks fire 2 additional arrows, right, which is a 0.01% chance, and then simultaneously slamming a 0.1% chance as well as slamming a 0.2% chance. The odds are not in your favor, and like I said, you could brick it very easily, right? But you could sit there and you could do that all day. You could fracture, you could chaos orb, you could, exalt slam and hope to get the modifier that you're looking for. Sometimes you'll hit, sometimes you won't. I did that earlier in the league with recombining gloves. I basically recombined gloves until I got a satisfiable outcome. For example, these gloves, I recombined melee skills with crit damage bonus. Tier 2 had a lot higher success rate, so I just stuck with it, and then I slammed until I got damage modifiers and the modifiers I was looking for, and then sort of worked it into my build, which is an option. You can use this recombiner. It actually is very profitable to use the recombiner for some items, so just keep that in mind. But again, if we were to just look at Craft of Exile, as I said, you could brick an item very easily by just rolling any modifier that has a higher item level requirement on the item than another modifier, right, that's less desirable. So in these situations, your best bet is to fracture, crit chance or crit damage bonus, chaos spam for bow attacks fire 2 additional arrows, and then begin the process of dextral erasing and whittling. Most likely whittling. You probably won't be using dextral erasers at this point, but you will essentially whittle the bow until you hit crit damage, crit chance, etc. Now, if we just do some math on this, if you were to do that, You know, you'd probably have to pay a couple divine to get a Gemini bow base that is also item level 82 or higher. Again, you want your base to have the item level requirement of what you can roll. So in this case, bow attacks fire 2 additional arrows. It needs an item level of 82. We don't have a choice to get like a level 73 bow to avoid rolling a higher modifier onto the bow, right? Which is something else I'll get into. But ideally, you would have a fractured T1% crit chance, which you could buy off of trade for relatively cheap. If we come here and we look at trade, and we search for a Gemini bow with, we come here and we add Gemini bow with crit chance, and we search, and this is just a little tip I'll give everyone. Let's search like 4.5%, which is tier 1% crit chance. Ideally, you'd want this to be as high as possible. And then you want to come in here and click not and type fractured, right? Because we're trying to fracture it, so we don't want to show ones that are already fractured. And then obviously not corrupted. This will help filter out trade a lot. But we come here and we actually selected the wrong one. We need to do this. Every item, if you're having trouble with search results showing, it probably just means that you searched the wrong modifier. But as you can see, we can buy a bow with tier 1 crit chance on it for 1 exalted orbs. We also want the item level to be at least 82 so that we can actually roll bow attacks fire an additional arrow. And unfortunately, these are significantly more value. These are 17 divines apiece. And so this might be a very difficult base or process to craft on, but we could also fracture crit damage bonus, right? And in order to do that, we'd come here and search around 35% crit damage bonus. This is not right, though. Critical damage bonus, and we'll search 35%, which is tier 1. And as you can see, this is actually a lot more affordable. You can buy these for 4 chaos, 20 chaos, etc. And you can fracture tier 1 crit damage bonus, and then annul the item, right? And you might have to buy a few of these and a few fracturing orbs, but essentially, once you get this fractured, you annul the item down so that it has no other modifiers on it. You will just have % critical damage bonus, right? And then you begin chaos spamming, and you're going to essentially chaos spam until you hit bow attacks fire 2 additional arrows. Now, as I said, this has a 0.1% chance actually of rolling. And we actually did this on stream before, and we went through 800 chaos orbs, which is roughly 45, 50 divines. And so just to hit bow attacks fire additional arrows, it is, you know, 50 divines on average, if not more, if not less, was the RNG that we experienced just to hit this modifier, right? So it's a couple divines just to buy the base and begin crafting. It's, you know, tens of divines just to hit the first modifier. And then once we hit bow attacks fire additional arrows, ideally we want critical hit chance, which T1, or attack speed T1, or +5 proj. There's different bows that you could build out. But if we take a look at any of these modifiers, right, 1% chance for +5 proj, 0.1% chance for critical hit chance, 0.5% chance for attack speed. Now, technically, it's a little bit higher than this because we already have modifiers such as these, you know, bow attacks fire additional arrows and crit damage bonus on the bow, meaning that these actually can't roll at all, and so the overall weight of the item is going to be a little bit different. But you know, you could go through 100 omens before you just hit that one modifier to finish the suffixes, which could be 500, 600, 400 divines, right? So just to finish the suffixes or prefixes on an item as a base, on average, takes 500 to 600 divines. And it is very unlikely that you are just going to be able to sell a very good item right away without, you know, proper exposure, without being a streamer, having an audience, or anything like that. You're going to struggle to sell items, and it's just the reality of the situation. But it's true. You know, I've seen a lot of streamers and a lot of individuals sell items that I myself had better versions listed for cheaper prices, but they sold their items because they had, you know, an audience or exposure, right? But if we come through here and, yeah, once you finish the suffixes on an item, the rest is essentially the same. For example, with the bow, once you finish the suffixes, you go into the prefixes, and now that the suffixes are done, you can use, if we come in game, sinistral erasures and sinistral modifiers, which affect prefixes, so that you never have to worry about breaking the suffixes. So what you would do is you would essentially use Omens of Sinistral Erasure, spam the prefixes until you get a desirable prefix. So with bows, you know, you'd want tier 1 flat fizz, tier 1 flat or tier 1 fizz percent, at tier 1 accuracy for, you know, Amazon builds. You'd want, you know, you could build an LE bow with triple T1 LE damage on it. You could do percent increased LE damage with attacks. There's a lot of modifiers that are actually pretty good on a bow. It's just a matter of rolling them tier 1. And again, rolling any tier 1 prefix modifier has about a 0.1% chance of success, or about 2% overall. So again, you could go through an additional 500-600 divines just to roll a T1 prefix on an item, and then you still have to roll 2 more prefixes, and ideally you want to roll the prefixes in item level orders. So let's say you wanted to build a fizz bow. Well, if you wanted to build a fizz bow, if we look at Craft of Exile, your best bet is to get percent increased physical damage first at tier 1 because it has an item level of 82, meaning that you can continue to use Sinistral Erasures with Omens of Whittling to prevent ever losing this modifier, right? So yeah, that's what I would recommend. You could get tier 1 fizz percent with tier 1 accuracy would be ideal, and then hopefully you're able to roll, you know, percent increased physical numbered accuracy, right, would be ideal. But the rest of these modifiers all have an item level of 81, meaning that if you roll one of them and you don't want it, such as tier 1 lightning, if you'd rather have tier 1 LE damage with attacks, but you roll tier 1 lightning instead, if you already had like tier 1 cold on there, you'd have to gamble losing, you know, one of these modifiers, right? So long story short, crafting is very expensive, but when it comes to crafting, especially if you're a console player, you probably want to have a mobile device next to you and be using some of these websites. But Craft of Exile and the PoE2 trade website are going to be your best friends. You want to price check relative items as you're trying to sell them using weighted sums so you can get a good idea of what the actual value of an item is. Sometimes, let's say you're using PoE2 overlay and you're on the PC and you price check an item, it will tell you that it's worth significantly more than it is because there might be other variants of the item listed for cheaper, right? If you're struggling to sell the item. For example, there could be a ring exactly like this with fire res on it instead of cold for half the price. And so that's maybe why this item is not selling. Now, personally, I believe this item's just not selling because I don't think lightning damage is that good of a roll with accuracy. And then, like I said, all res or chaos res just have a lot more value on a ring than a tier 1 normal res because, yeah, it's just unfortunate. But it is what it is. Probably going to get over cold capped trying to mirror this with an ingenuity or anything along those lines. So that's essentially crafting in a nutshell in PoE2. Your fracturing bases, if you want to craft an item out from scratch, your fracturing bases, you are, you know, chaos spamming them, annulling them. Let's say you hit a tier 1 modifier like tier 1 dex, but you were trying to hit a tier 1 damage modifier. You can slam the item or potentially keep modifiers that you hit on accident, because sometimes what will happen is, for example, when I was crafting out this ring right here, we kept, when I was using Omens of Whittling, this was at one point in time, and thanks to Bruck again for this ring, at one point in time, this ring here had no modifiers on it except T1 Fizz, T1 Cold, right? So at that point, we just whittle over and over and over until we hit a prefix that we want. But if you do hit a suffix and it's not a suffix that you want, you can use Omens of Dextral Annulment, right, which are the purpose of those, and save yourself a little bit of divines from having to use, you know, more whittlings, because whittlings are more expensive. But you could use a Dextral Annulment to remove the prefix and then use a Sinistral Exaltation to guarantee that your next Exile orb adds a prefix modifier as opposed to a suffix modifier, right? Which will help save you some money in the long run. But yeah, like I said, for most players in the game, you're probably going to want to stay away from crafting. Originally, when I was going to make this video, I had spent around a mirror on crafting a +5 lightning wand, and my goal was to use it for my build and provide, because I wanted to do a Temporalis build at the time, so I wanted to use it for my own build and provide free mirror service on it. Now, unfortunately, that wand only sold for 200 divines, and I put 1,500 into it. I had it listed forever at different price points. It price checked for a minimum of 600 to 700, but we had to eventually let it go for significantly less. And yeah, we lost all of our money crafting out that wand, which was very, very unfortunate. You'll see I have some overpriced items in trade, or right now it's just items I was just price checking by posting them because there weren't many items similar. Which is also something you can do, is you can just post items for obscene amounts and lower it, in an hour or two if no one messages you, especially if you're posting on TFT, and see where it kind of goes from there. But yeah, it basically just comes down to having knowledge of different bases and different modifiers, how they roll on an item. If we were to take a look, for example, some items you want to be lower item levels. If we take a look at trade here and we go to vol wraps, which are a very good glove base, for example, this is an issue that I had earlier in the league. But if we search vol wraps, you'll see that for the prefixes, because most people who are trying to craft their own gloves probably want, +2 melee skills, double damage roll with crit damage bonus, or triple damage roll, which are what, my gloves are, double damage roll. So most people, when they're crafting gloves, most likely, would like to craft prefixes out while having good suffixes, right? So you'd probably, like I said for gloves, recombine +2 melee skills with crit damage bonus to get a desirable outcome. It would take you a while, but you can buy each of those bases +2 melee skills as well as crit damage bonus for around 1 Exalted Orb each. So for around 100 Exalted Orbs, you can craft a pair of gloves that have both of those modifiers, +2 melee and crit damage bonus. But if we take a look at the prefixes here, again, we have the same situation as the chaos damage on breach rings, where if the item level of the gloves is higher than 77, we can actually roll % evasion and energy shield number to max life, which has a higher item level requirement, so any existing damage rolls on the item can actually be bricked or be potentially removed in the process of rolling this modifier, which has a significantly higher chance to roll on the item than any of these modifiers, right? Which actually happened to me. I knew it could happen. I just gambled a little bit. But if you take a look here, we have a pair of 100% increased effect of socketed item gloves with crit damage bonus and a tier 1 res on them. But as you can see here, they're item level 82, and I actually bricked these twice with tier 1 damage rolls on them because I rolled that % evasion flat energy shield roll onto the item, which again wouldn't happen if the item level was 77. So some items you want to make sure are lower item levels, like gloves for example, so that you can't roll certain modifiers so that it can't brick, right? But it's going to be different for everyone. It all depends on what you're trying to craft. But like I said, for the most part, with most items, right, for example, let's say you have a ring. What's most likely going to be most people's case is they have an item and they have a bad modifier or a modifier that they don't need on that item. For example, these gloves. If I ever decided I didn't need max life, I could gamba removing it, but we'd also risk getting that evasion energy shield, which we could never remove, right? So I just haven't wanted to do that. We could also gamba removing the fire res on these since I don't really need it anymore. I am over fire capped, but again, with this fire res, if we were to try and remove this, there's always the chance we get something less desirable. So if we look at Craft of Exile, especially because our crit damage bonus is tier 2. So fire res as it stands has an item level requirement of 48, and if we look at crit damage bonus, it has an item level requirement of 45. So we actually can't remove, in this case, the fire res before the crit damage bonus. What we'd have to do is we would have to gamba it with just a dextral erasure and hope that we hit the 50-50 because the melee skills are fractured. So yeah, it can be a little bit rough sometimes, a little bit difficult to sort of craft as a whole. And like I said, unless you have thousands of divines, I really wouldn't recommend most people to just start crafting because it's going to be a massive money sink. Every item I've crafted this league, I've lost money on. There's not one item I've ever made money. I've just had fun crafting and spending my divines. We probably could have had 3 mirrors right now. 1 for sure, 2 potentially, maybe 3, if I never touched any items in terms of crafting apart from my own gear. So I hope this video helps. I hope you guys learned something. I'll try to include some captions and some extra information throughout the video. I'm sorry if I didn't cover any topics, if I forgot anything. I didn't try to. I'm not the best crafter in this game, but I do know some of the resources, and I'm just sharing some of the information I've learned along the way with you guys. And like I said, I would personally stay away from people such as Belton, because most of their divines that they receive to craft with are on loan. They're crafting items for other people, and at the end of the day, you'll probably end up losing a lot of money if you try to do the same thing as them. Belton oversells and overprices a lot of items. I have a lot of people who message me on Discord very angry, who said that Belton sold the items for, let's say, 50 or 100 divines, and they just lost lots of money because the item really only price checked for like 10 div. A good example is Belton sold one of my viewers a +3 proj, 15% crit chance, 15% crit damage bonus amulet with strength on it, tier 2, and a couple other rolls for like 100 divines, right? And the reality is, if we just do the math on it, you cannot roll the strength or any other modifier that was on it off, because the crit damage and the crit hit chance were so low rolls, right, that you just couldn't ever get anything else off. And if we just search a similar amulet real quick before I end the video, if we search a similar amulet, and we come here on trade, and we search, you can buy the exact same amulet for 5 divines, right? Listed 5 days ago. There's actually lots of them if I open my display camera. So as you can see here, there are lots of amulets with crit chance, crit damage bonus, and +3 proj on them for 5 divines, 7 divines, 5 divines. If we, click here, this Janubu guy, by the way, this guy owns 99.999% of the items in the game worth a mirror. He is most likely a guild crafter, or a profit crafter, or a real-world trader. Probably real-world traded to get into the idea of crafting. But another thing, too, is that anytime you see someone with multiple listings on the market, I would probably stay away from them. Like this Aloy guy, Aloy D, he has multiple amulet listings, which means he has probably been trying to craft amulets for a while. He's probably lost money, and so these are most likely overpriced in an attempt for him to cut his losses. As you can see, those were 50 to 55 divines, but again, if we just search, there are plenty of amulets up for 5 divines. You might be sacrificing 1% crit chance. Actually, you wouldn't be on this one for 9 divines. But you might be sacrificing a little bit of crit chance, but at the cost of 60, 70 extra divines, or even a mirror, in my opinion, that's worth it, right? Some of these are bad. The price goes up pretty quick, but even right here, you can see, life, energy shield, percent evasion, +3. This is not a bad amulet for 24 div, but I would say this is more worth, in my opinion, closer to 10 div from my experience. Using live search is another good option for search. If you live search and you just leave your computer for a little bit, you'll see all the new listings, or if you just leave this open while you're playing, you'll see all the listings that come up that are new, which will help you snipe items that might be normally very expensive for relatively cheap. Hopefully be able to snipe them from people who are doing the same things just to relist them and resell them for a profit, right? But again, as I said, hopefully you guys learned something from this video. This is not the best or most perfect crafting video. Obviously, we don't really have any divines to work with right here because I lost them all crafting to be able to show you guys, the process of crafting. But for example, like on this ring, I would sit here with Sinistral Erasures or Sinistral Annulments and just permanently spam this ring until I hit a T1 damage or T1 rarity roll. And then I would use Omens of Whittling and potentially Omens of Sinistral Erasure to finish it off. If you only have one modifier, you use, erasures. If you have more than one modifier for the prefixes or suffixes, you need to start using Omens of Whittling. And then you need to combine the two if, let's say, you're working on the prefixes, but you have a suffix that's a lower item level roll. In that case, you have to roll it out differently. Close my display capture here. Again, guys, thank you very much for tuning in. If you have any questions, comment down below. We do have a Discord now. I'll put the Discord link in the comment section. I appreciate you guys watching, and I have been live streaming as well if you guys want to tune in and just watch the live stream and sort of see, how it goes, how some of the crafting goes. We do a lot of trial runs. We do a lot of viewer gambas, crafting, etc. And it's a lot of fun. If you want to have some fun, if you want to mess around with your currency and try to make some money, it's a good option. But overall, 99% of the time, I will say, most players will just lose their currency. And part of the reason why is that most of these players, such as that Janubu guy, that Genebu guy probably has 35 tabs open, live searching items, buying, relisting, buying every craftable base in the game, which is a big problem. I'm actually really proud that Farmer actually decided to do a challenge where he actually played the game instead of just sitting in his hideout. I think there's a lot of things that GGG could do to try to fix this situation of people just buying and relisting items and profit crafting as a whole. I think they should make it so that you can't use trade or interact with other players unless you're actually playing the game. Like, you need to have spent a certain amount of time in a map. And then, like I said, I do think they need to fix the state of omens, because as it currently stands, you guys saw it could take 100, 200, 300 omens just to hit one modifier on an item, which is why I said most of the time you only want to craft on an item that has at least 4 good modifiers to begin with. Such as this ring, which even this ring isn't the best. An attribute would be a lot better than just, for example, lightning res, or chaos res would be significantly better than lightning res. But anyways, for the 5th, 10th, 15th time, again, I really appreciate you guys tuning in. I appreciate the support. I love all of you guys. Have a wonderful day. Have a blessed day. And yeah, check out my stream if you guys have the free time to do so. Peace out.